We have a loaded gun. We could use it to shoot ourselves in the foot or the face, or we could shoot each other. It is a very powerful tool that we can use in really bad ways.
People have come up with, slurs for robots basically, and there's been this whole like uproar of, is it right to call like robots clankers, or is that a restart of the phenomenon of like previous slurs, or is it actually wrong to consider that wrong because then you're giving more rights to robots?
Yeah, I was interviewed for an article that I think the New York Times was writing about the word clanker, and I hadn't heard it prior to that because I'm not as online as some people. But
So I'm about to hop into a Zoom call with Brown University professor Michael Littman. I am super excited because he actually invented a framework that is the foundation for a huge chunk of modern AI. And he currently actually is in charge of essentially how AI affects the university in real time. So yeah, let's get into the conversation. Yeah, I mean, my first question, and I love to ask this to people, is if you were to like meet a stranger, how would you, and they've never heard of your job before, how would you explain what you do?
yeah, it's funny that you say that because I've been a researcher in artificial intelligence since the 1980s, and most of my interactions with people up to that time, if they asked what I did, I'd be like, "I'm an artificial intelligence researcher," and they're like, "What now?" But now it's everything changed, right? So now everybody's got an opinion about AI. People often ask me about AI before they even know that this is what I do, because people just talk about AI now. So it is very surprising. So there's at some level, I think there's a lot more of an understanding. Like I don't really have to explain myself very much. On the other hand, my actual job title at the moment is I am Brown University's Associate Provost for Artificial Intelligence. And if you were to ask me to formally define any of those words, I would fail, right? Because like artificial intelligence, like I have a sense of what it is. I've been in the field for decades, but like there's not a crisp definition of like, well, this is AI, this is not AI. And now it's gotten crazy because for some people, AI means ChatGPT, and for other people, AI means anything that a computer does. And so it is very narrow and very broad at the same time. And nobody knows what a provost is. That's super confusing. And the associate provost, that's just adding more weirdness on top of weirdness. And then, for FOR, like, yeah, associate provost for artificial intelligence. I guess I could probably make a good story about what the word for means, but it's very generic. So, yes, it is definitely hard to tell people what it is that I do. But what I actually do is I coordinate our university's response to AI, helping students and faculty figure out like where should we be going, how should we be doing this, what could we be doing better, what should we watch out for. So that's I'm mostly trying to help everybody on the topic of AI.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that breakdown. That was honestly something I was unfamiliar with when I first read that title too. So yeah, I kind of want to get into some of the stuff that you did. You mentioned you started your work like in the 90s, and you actually co-created like really foundational like reinforcement learning frameworks, like the Markov games and stuff like that. What did you think AI would look like by now compared to what it actually looks like right now?
It is really funny to see people who've been in the field for a while trying to figure out what the heck just happened, right? Because there's a sense in which the problems that we've been working on for years and years and years and years are solved, but they're not solved in a way that it feels like they're actually solved. Like we now have software that can do the things that we wanted to be able to do since the 70s, really, 60s maybe, late 50s. And yet we kind of thought it would be different. And I think the way that we thought it would be different is that we'd have a deeper understanding of intelligence and cognitive information processing. And instead, we have this sort of weird thing where we trained up models using lots and lots and lots of data, and they're really, I don't want to say smart, but they're like really capable. They're able to do all sorts of things that we wanted computers to be able to do, but we didn't learn how they did them. And in many cases, you have to change the definition of what it means to have solved the problem to say that these systems solve the problem. I feel like see if I can think of an example. I mean, for me, it comes down to like imagine you're creating a computer database that you can use to look up all kinds of information about, I don't know, like what classes are available in your school, something like that. And like 80% of the time, it gives you exactly the answer that you'd expect. And then like 10% of the time, it says there's no answer, but in fact, there's an answer and just didn't see it. And 10% of the time, it just completely makes something up that is just wrong. Like, would we call that a good database system? And the answer is no, not by the criteria that we would have used in the past. But like, is it still useful? Yeah, probably. It's still worth having. It's just it's solving a problem that's slightly different than that's related to, but not the same as the problem that we've been solving. And I feel like that about AI. I feel like most of what is happening in artificial intelligence is like, oh, we've now solved a slightly different problem than the one we actually wanted to solve. And now we have to decide, is that good enough? Can we stop thinking about the old problem? Or is it not good enough? In which case, we still have to solve the problems that we were working on for all these years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point because it's all, like predictions based, like, oh, what's the next word or what's the next token? But there's also recently this interesting phenomenon of AI in research. Like, can AI create new findings that like humans have not come up with before that's not in its training data? Do you believe that this is potentially a possibility?
Oh yeah, I mean it's already happening. And but it's really interesting because I don't know what the year was. It might have been like early 80s. Like I think I was in high school, so because I'm very old, but we had this really interesting crisis in mathematics when a fundamental result that was it was a long-standing conjecture that you could take any kind of like any map that consists of like countries or states, just region or counties, like regions of the 2D plane. Could you always color them, like add color to each individual unit of the map so that no two adjacent states or countries or counties have the same color, right? So you don't want them to have the same color because then they'll look like they're one blob. So you want them to all have distinct colors if they're touching each other. And it was observed that it seemed like you could always color a map with four colors. But like mathematically, can you prove that? And the answer was nobody could prove it. And then what happened was some researchers put together a computer program to just grind through all the different possibilities and for each one verify that in fact yes you can do it, yes you can do it, yes you can do it. Now the mathematicians had to be really clever to set that up so it wasn't an infinitely long program, right? Because there's an infinite number of different maps that you could imagine drawing, but they figured out how to break it down and they focused it in and then they had the computer grind through and it was something like I don't know 150 page proof with just example after example after example. And so people were like, okay, it's proven now. And other people were like, that wasn't proven by a person, that doesn't count. And so the whole field had to kind of figure out, well, wait a second, like, what do we mean when we say this has been proven? Do we actually have to understand it? Like, is it really the insight, the mathematical insight and understanding, or is it just verifying that in fact it's true? It's a fact. You can't understand why it's a fact, but we can show that it is in fact a fact. And so I think ultimately it was that community came to the conclusion that yeah, that's a proof. It's not particularly elegant. It's grotesque. Like it's really complicated and doesn't give you any kind of insight. But yes, we now assert that any map can be colored with four colors. Later, mathematicians went back and improved the argument, it shrunk down. It's still a lot of weird special cases, but it's like it went from 150 pages down to 7 pages. So like it's a
Oh, wow.
simpler thing now.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, like that kind of crisis of like, does this count as a result is exactly, I think, what we're experiencing now. We have computer programs that can generate proofs. Um, in some cases, they're solving problems that human beings have been working on for 20 years and haven't been able to figure out the answer. And it's like now the computer has the answer. What does that mean for the field? What does that mean for the way we do math? What is it going to mean for the way we do science? Meteorology, geology, like all these different fields are being impacted, and they're all having to grapple with the question of does this even count?
Yeah, that's so interesting. Which year was the map experiment done in?
Like I said, I think it was early 80s, but not an experiment. It
Wow.
was a mathematical proof, but
Yeah.
it's called the four color theorem.
Oh,
And
wow. Early 80s. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because it was a computer program, but it wasn't, 1976 by Ken Apple and Wolfgang Haken, according to
Oh, wow.
according to the AI overview, ironically. So that dates, and that fits because I would have been 10 years old then, and it's something I would have heard of, but wouldn't have been. I wasn't in the field, like it wasn't something that I felt particularly threatened by. But I found the news stories about it really intriguing because it's this sort of interesting philosophical question. 19, so it was 3 years before I first played with a computer. So understanding the implications of, oh, a computer proved this, like that didn't mean anything to me at that time, but it meant a lot to me shortly after that.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I think before this, I kind of had this naive thought that, like, research. When I thought of research and AI doing research, I was just thinking of AlphaFold or like the more recent stuff. I had no clue about like this earlier stuff. So that's
Oh
awesome.
yeah, yeah. I mean, people like computers have been around
Yeah.
for a long, long time, and but it's always sort of a matter of how much work is the person doing to make the computer helpful, right? Because
Yeah.
in many like back then there was no we couldn't talk to the computer and explain to it what we wanted to do. We had to write computer programs and we had to interpret the computer program. So the computer was just sort of this just like I said, sort of crank through it. It was just this mechanical thing that went through all the different pieces and allowed us to automate that, right? In many ways that's exactly what computers still are, but now they have this they seem they seem intelligent, like a person is intelligent because they're so good at language and language is so core to how we connect with each other and assess each other's intelligence. So it feels like we're dealing with a different kind of thing now, but in fact most of the work so I'll stick with most of the work where an AI system has actually made a breakthrough, like a scientific breakthrough. It's because there was people setting it up just so that the computer could do the piece that was missing, and then there'd be an answer. But the computer didn't come up with the question. The computer didn't even come up with the approach to solving the question. The computer just like got you that last little distance that the people were struggling with. So is that useful? I think it's useful. Is that, wow, human beings have no role in the world anymore? No, like I don't see that at all. Like at the beginning and the end of the day, the reason that this is exciting is because these computer programs are generating proofs that people care about. If the computers were generating proofs that people didn't care about, people wouldn't care. So like people have a really important role to play in deciding what to care about.
Yeah. I think that's a really awesome optimistic message. I think you also said seems intelligent. So I'm curious, do you think artificial intelligence, like what do you consider intelligence, I guess?
Right. So I used to teach an intro AI class, and the first lecture or the second lecture, definitely in the first week, I would say like, what is intelligence? And I would list on my visuals, here's a bunch of different things that philosophers had said about it, and then I'd be like, I don't know, man. Like, am I intelligent? Are you intelligent? I don't know. How do we even know? Am I just a brain in a vat? Like, what is like? It all seems really pointless to have this discussion, and I was very dismissive of philosophy because I felt like they were just kind of going around and not really talking about anything that's important. I feel differently now. Like I really feel like what this moment has done for people is refocused us on the philosophical foundations of what our world is, right? And so the question, a question like what is intelligence, which I used to be like, we'll know it when we see it. Like I don't know why we need to fight about this because we'll know it when we see it. I don't know if I'm seeing it or not anymore. So I really
Yeah.
do want philosophical answers to questions like that. And I think, I think at the end of the day, with philosophy, it can be really useful. Not that it's different. I think it's different than science. Like, I think science is like, okay, let's figure out what is. Philosophy is more like, what would be a good way to look at this? And there's many different ways to look at it, but what would be a way that would just like where the pieces kind of fit together better than they do now? And I think we need that. I think we need to have a better understanding of what do we mean when we say consciousness? What do we mean when we say intelligence? Um, I'm hoping that if nothing else, this exercise, the existence of all these chatbots and the way that people are interacting with them will give us some leverage on answering a question like that. Because I don't think intelligence just is, right? It's a word that people invented to describe something that they saw. And now we're seeing something different. And we're like, how does that word apply to this new thing? I don't know. We get to decide. Like we're making up the words, right? That again, people have a really important role in making up words. we have to figure out how those words actually apply. And so I think that, um, I think at the end of the day, we're going to have a definition of intelligence that's going to be like what people have, and there's going to be a definition of intelligence of what these computers do, and they might end up being different words because they're really not exactly the same thing.
Yeah. And I think the word intelligence can also, like, we can bring it into bio, intelligent life found on another planet or things
Mm.
like that. And I think also culturally it's kind of done something to us. Like, especially for me, I've grown up like a lot on the internet and stuff. And people have come up with, slurs for robots basically. And there's been this whole like uproar of, is it right to call like robots clankers, or is that like a restart of the phenomenon of like previous slurs, or like is it actually wrong to consider that wrong because then you're giving more rights to robots? Like, there's a whole debate about this, and it's interesting to look at, given
I
like
was,
what you were
yeah,
talking
I was interviewed for an article that I think the New York Times was writing about the word clanker, and I
about.
hadn't
Oh,
heard it prior
oh
to
wow.
that because I'm not as online as some people, but yeah, no, I dove into that. It really is very interesting, and again, like these systems don't have feelings, right? So it's not like are we offending them, but by denigrating an other, right? Is that just making it easier for us to denigrate other people? And that's something we shouldn't be doing. So yeah, it all gets tied up in human culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think you spent a lot of your career in like this responsible AI field. I think a little bit earlier than most of the world kind of caught up to this, like transparency, bias, stuff like that. So, where do you think currently the field is failing or like not really addressing the actual problems that we're having?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the field has done a pretty good job of looking at traditional methods in statistics and machine learning and understanding what it means for them to be biased and what it means and how we can mitigate the biases, right? How we can make systems that are making decisions in ways that are transparent, that are defensible, right? And not just like I don't like these kind of people, right? I mean, the machine learning systems never are doing it on the basis of like or dislike. They don't have those kinds of feelings, but they're trained on data that where people have kind of expressed those feelings. And so, if these systems are perpetuating those biases and those discriminatory behaviors and actions, that would be bad. I think we have really good ways now of intervening in those systems and making sure they don't act like that. And that's great. The problem is, of course, that all the oxygen in the room is now owned by large language models, right? These giant statistical models that we don't know how to intervene on, and we don't even know how biased they are because they're so complicated. They're so big. Like I think of it as like we're used to kind of exploring a house, and now all of a sudden we discover a house that is the size of a planet, and we're like,
Yeah.
we don't know what's going on in most of the rooms. Like we can't visit all the rooms, and there could be terrible things happening in some of those rooms. I feel like with LLMs, there could be terrible things, and in many cases, we can find some of those terrible things that the network has imbibed and now is part of its behavior, but it's not using all of it's not like a person where it has some consistent personality across all its uses. It's a whole, like I said, it's like a really big planet-sized house with lots of rooms in it, and each room can be decorated entirely differently. So some of the rooms are racist, right? Because why? Well, we trained it on, or the people who built them trained it on the data of people, including some stuff that was not great. Even it's partly because racists are posting on the internet, but also partly because even books about racism describe racism. So, like, the concept is really well instantiated in the literature. These systems take that on board. How they're going to behave in any given instance is extremely difficult to predict because it's not just one thing. It's a, honeycomb of all these different little compartments. So, yeah, so that's the thing that, like, I feel like we understand how to deal with bias really well, except for in the model that actually matters, where we don't really know anything about how to deal with it.
Yeah, and I'm curious on how this goes into, like your role at Brown University. Like, how does responsible AI in education, because I know like bias is different, like if you have like a biased model, I guess that wouldn't really matter to like a college student who's trying to write an essay. But, like what are kind of the debatable guidelines you guys are having in Brown University right now that you're kind of choosing between that are heated topics, I guess. Yeah.
There's a lot of that. And there's a lot that needs to be talked about that's not being talked about. Mostly the big debate on campus so far has been around the use of generative AI in teaching and learning. So more or less like what is okay for a student to use a chatbot for in the context of a class? And there are some faculty members who feel like everything about this is bad, and anything that a student touches, it's just bad. Like they should not be doing this. We're not going to talk about it. um, then there's other folks who are like, oh, but this is really important because people are in the working world are using these tools. And if we don't expose our students to that, we're really putting our students at a tremendous disadvantage. Like we have to find a way of integrating knowledge about this stuff into our classes. And in which case, then they should be using generative AI in some form or another. So we put out a report 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, like really, really recently, because we worked on it for something like 18 months. So like it's very fresh and it's out there. You can find a pointer to it, or I can send you a pointer to it if anybody wants to see it. But it's basically our assessment of how it's being used in teaching and learning on our campus and elsewhere. What are people's attitudes on campus towards using it in teaching and learning on our campus and comparing it to other surveys that have been done outside of our campus? What sort of recommendations did we as a committee have for the university in terms of how we can make rules around this going forward? And a lot of it, so mostly I hesitated when I said rules just now because I really don't think rules is where we need to start. I think rules are important. Rules are really helpful, especially when, different people are interacting and they have different goals. Like you have to have some kind of rules. But the biggest problem that we have at the moment is each of us has a completely different understanding of what is happening right now. And we can't make rules that would be meaningful until we kind of get closer to being on the same page. And so one of the things that I think is most important is for people to be talking to each other everywhere, but like for Brown, like at Brown, like people at Brown, the faculty, the staff, the instructors, the administrators, like we all need to be talking about this stuff and seeing it through other people's eyes so we can come to a shared understanding. At that point, we can say, this is okay, this is not okay. This is okay in this situation, this is not okay in that situation. That I think that's where we're headed, but I don't think we can start. I've gotten criticized by, for example, one of my good friends who I went to college with. He works at Google. He's like, I don't understand why you guys don't have rules yet. Like we have rules. Their rules are basically you can do whatever you want. You just have to get the job done. Like, yeah, that makes sense, but you're not trying to teach people. Like we're in the business of actually teaching students to help bring them from where they start to a more advanced kind of perspective. And if AI does all the work in between, the students are not gaining any knowledge, they're not gaining any skill, and we're not preparing them for the world. So I think our challenge is actually much larger than at a place like Google, where okay, if it's a tool and it does the job, you can use it. Whereas here it's like, yeah, but we have to take into consideration the impact on the learning process.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you mentioned that report, and I actually did come across it. And one of the interesting points was that a large amount of the syllabuses or syllabi,
Syllabi. I like
3,000
syllabi.
syllabi, 3,000 of them had no like generative AI policy in them, or something like that. And something about, each individual professor is allowed to like choose how they deal with it. And you were kind of talking about that case by case scenario. Do you think this approach would make sense for most universities, or do you think there should be some kind of like overarching thing for the whole school, and then each individual professor decides based
We're
on that?
struggling with exactly this question. It's a great question. In the report, we recommend that there be a campus default policy that any instructor can override in a class, right? Like in my class, you can use this stuff, but you can't use this stuff. Um, but if they don't say anything, there needs to be some kind of shared understanding of what's okay and what's not okay. And so we said a committee should be formed, and they should articulate what this baseline policy is, like the policy when there's no policy. Um, and we probably, arguably, we need that at the level of the entire university. Then each of the schools, like the medical school, the arts and sciences, the public health. Like each of the schools should have their policy, then maybe each of the departments in those schools, and then maybe each of the classes, and then maybe each assignment can override, right? Because for
Yeah.
this assignment, it's okay, but last, for the class as a whole, it's not. But we're going to look at it in a special way right now, so you can do it or you can't do it. Um, it's going to be complicated and a mess. Do I think that makes sense for most schools? Like I do, I don't understand. I don't really have a clear alternative, right? We can make so I will propose a rule right now. This is a rule that we propose in the report, but I'll share it with you, which is I think it would make sense to say you should not be using AI for anything that would not be okay for you to ask another student to do for you. Right. So you can, if you kind of think of an AI as a chatbot as being a kind of another student in the class, if it would be okay to ask another student in the class for this, then it's okay to ask the chatbot and vice versa. So the example that the two polls that I tend to think about is like, okay, would it be okay for you to ask another student in the class, like the test is coming up, can you help me make up questions? And we'll like ask each other questions and just try to like understand the material well so that going into the exam, I'll be ready. I think that's often okay for student-student contact, and I actually think it's pretty reasonable to allow students to use generative AI in that way, like as a sounding board that they can try ideas out on to prepare for exams. On the other hand, would it be okay for a student to ask another student, "Hey, we just got the homework assignment this week. Could you write a first draft of my answers? Don't worry, I will put it in my own words before I hand it in." No, that's clearly cheating. That is absolutely 100%. Like I think everybody can recognize that that's cheating. But I've heard people say to me that it should be okay for them to use AI in that way. And I'm like, no, I think that's actually really clear that you should not be using AI in that way. So I think there's the rule like this would have some things be okay and some things not be okay. And it would be kind of easy to remember because it leverages our shared understanding that we had up to this point. Like before generative AI, we had an understanding of like what's okay to do in a class and what's not. Could I pay someone down the street to build my project for me? Like, well, you could, but it would be wrong. Like you shouldn't, right? It's if you get caught, you could get in trouble, and you should accept that because you made a mistake. You should not have done that. Same thing with the generative AI. So we tried that out in the committee, and oh man, professors are really, really good at finding all the loopholes and all the mistakes and all the like, well, but couldn't you think of it this way? And so we could not come to any kind of shared understanding of a baseline.
Mhm.
So we're very much encouraging individual professors to state what their rules are on their syllabi. And we're trying to give people suggestions about how to structure that, how to think about it so that they can come to a policy. But so at the moment, it's being left to individual faculty members.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because like college is such a different environment. I think right now in high school, a lot of our assignments are being moved to like in-person essays or things like that. But it like comes to a point, right? Like you can't code an entire project in class. Well, I guess you could. It depends on the project. But
Yeah,
yeah.
but it limits right? The kind of projects like in the old days, by which I mean like 5 years ago, we could assign a really complex multi-stage project and really give students a chance to just dig in and think about it and compare and develop it over a period of time. And that's harder to do now, right? Because once they go off, one of our deans describes it as like everyone's doing their homework with the answer key right next to them on the desk. And then we're asking them not to look at it, but it's like it's right there on the desk. So people are, you give them a big project like that, they're going to engage with the generative AI. If that's not, if that's not allowed, if that actually undermines their ability to do the project, that's really messed up. You can't do something that big and complicated in an in-person setting. There just isn't time for that. And I think in college classes, I regularly teach classes with 200, 300 students in them. I think that's pretty rare in a high school. The opportunity to like look every single student in the eye and like see them working on the problem and understand whether they're really doing it on their own, it just isn't there when you're talking about a class of that size. And so it could be that we now have to either teach less detailed, less dense material so that we can do it in person and watch people while they're working. Or we need to make much smaller classes, right? We need a new model. And I think there's a lot of complaining about how expensive higher education is. this is not going to make it cheaper. This is going to make it a lot more expensive. Now, some people say, "Oh, but don't worry, you can just have the chat bots interact with people on an individual basis, and you're done. Ta-da!" And like, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I feel like it's a very fighting fire with fire thing, and we just get more fire.
I mean, I notice you have like generally a pretty optimistic view of this whole like tech ethics, responsible AI stuff. And I'm wondering if, like for example, like the AI and education stuff that we were just talking about, or any of the previous stuff, are any of the stuff in the media or online overblown, like opinions about AI, I guess? Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's a movie that came out, oh really just a couple months ago, called, I think it's called The AI Doc. I think that's what it's called, doc, short for documentary. And it starts off with the guy who's making the movie interviewing all the people who are I think he leads off with the pessimists, right? So people who are like, this is the end of everything. Like we're not going to be able to think anymore. It's the data centers are going to take all our natural resources. We're just like our entire society, the way that we structure society, it's all over. It's all falling apart. We're never going to recover from this. Then and like it was very dark, and I'm thinking, I don't think he's hearing from all the different voices here. So then he went to the optimists, and the optimists, okay, so I will, this will be colored with my own bias. So just, I want to
Yeah.
flag that. But like the optimists were just as crazy as the pessimists. And they were saying things that were like, no, 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 no. But AI, it's going to, first of all, it'll make us smarter and happier. And it's going to take us to other planets and it's going to cure all diseases. And I was like, no, like I don't think that's the story moving forward. It's not this like everything's going to be awesome because now we have like a digital god that's going to take care of us no matter what happens. Like that's not realistic either. And he did eventually get to something a little bit more nuanced and mixed, but like the fact that the debate always seems to be between the crazy pessimists and the crazy optimists means that it's all crazy. Like we're only hearing crazy.
Yeah.
We're finishing up a video series that we developed, and it's called AI. It's not as bad as you think, but it's pretty bad, right? And that's you say that I'm an optimist. I don't know that I'm an optimist. I'm certainly not one of the crazy optimists.
Yeah.
I really do worry that we could, we have a loaded gun. We could use it to shoot ourselves in the foot or the face, or we could shoot each other. Like it is a very powerful tool that we can use in really bad ways. But a lot of what you hear, so the reason that the videos are called AI, it's not as bad as you think, is because there's so much messaging around the every single thing about this is bad. And all of those arguments are overblown. All those arguments really focus in on the worst case, least likely kind of possibility and don't really like allow for the possibility that like, no, we're going to mitigate some of those. Like it's not that bad. But all those things that people are worried about are all valid. They're all real. They're all concerns. And so I think it's hard for people to live in that kind of liminar, I think that's the word. But like in this in-between space, right? Where it's between the like, yes, this really is a problem, but it has mitigations and we don't have to assume that it's all doom. We have to just to deal with we have to deal with that problem. And we can, but we have to. You can't ignore it and you can't obsess over it. You just have to deal with it. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing in AI really needs that attitude of like you just have to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. If someone were to watch this entire interview, what's, like the one, I guess, shift that you want them to leave with from this episode?
Yeah, well, it's hard to tell because I'm only hearing you. I don't know where the other people are coming from.
Yeah.
But I always my theory is always like the interviewer is a stand-in for the audience, right? So like, what would I want you to leave with? And I don't know. I mean, it seems like you already have a pretty rational, nuanced view here. Like, I don't think you're coming up and saying, "But how are you going to stop all these terrible things from happening?" And you're also not saying like, "Why are you worried about any of those terrible things? None of it can happen." Like, I feel like you're already kind of you have your eyes open, you have your ears open, you have your mind open, and you're actually thinking about this stuff. So that's what I would hope that other people could come away with as well. That this is, in some ways, is like the most exciting time at the moment because everything is up for grabs. Everything's up for interpretation. We have an opportunity to help make sense of the world. And so I don't know how like science classes have been for you, but I always remember hearing about the physicists from the 1920s who were like the first people to try to figure out all these different things that we now take for granted, but like or the mathematicians in the 1800s, like the conceptual foundation of what we do was established by these people a long time ago, and we're just kind of playing it out. We have an opportunity right now to set the conceptual foundations for future generations, and we need to do it. Like we can't just like, oh yeah, it's just going to happen. It's not just going to happen. Like we have to do it. And I don't we don't know where those great insights are going to come from. They could come from anybody. And so, pay attention, think about things, share your ideas with other people. Like as a community, as a group, we will come out of this okay, but only if we use our best thinking.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of this joke that's going around that's like, if I was Newton, like of course an object in motion stays in motion. Like I could have come up with that. And it's kind of like now this is like the opportunity to like do that thing that like is so obvious to us like 100 years later, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, right. It seems so obvious, but it's actually also completely false, right? Objects in motion do not remain in motion. All the time, objects slow down and stop. But then you have to say, oh, but that's because of friction or that's because of other forces. And that was the observation that he made. That's what makes it not obvious, right? It's like, no, it's not obvious that it's going to stay in motion and because nothing in our experience has ever done that. There's always other forces at play. There is no idealized smooth plane. But like if you imagine there is, that turns out to be a really fruitful way of thinking about the problem. And now, right, and now it's completely obvious. But yeah, we need more obvious things. I worry though that one of the differences between this sort of AI world that we're in now and physics, we used to think about AI more like physics. Like we'd come up with like what are the laws of, there's like Newton has like four laws, three laws of motion, something like that. But like small number of rules, and if you just follow those rules, it actually explains a tremendous amount of stuff.
Yeah.
AI systems have trillions of parameters, right? There's every reason to believe that the reason that they're successful is because they're not simple. They're not boiled down to three rules. They're like a trillion rules, right? And that way, all the different subcases all get covered, but there's no single clean overarching viewpoint that you can take that makes it all make sense. You live in the muck, you live in the complexity. And so it may be that we don't get to do that. I worry that there isn't going to be Newton's laws of neural networks because their power comes from their complexity.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. Yeah. I haven't thought too much about that, but that's something that I guess I can take away for myself to think about. Yeah, this was an awesome conversation. This was really interesting. I hadn't really thought too much about, like AI in education from like more of a moral standpoint rather than like, oh, my teachers are forcing me to do this and this. So this was interesting. Thank you so much for joining me and for giving us these insights from, like what you've done, your work throughout your life and what you're currently doing right now. Thank you.
Thanks for the chance to talk about it with you.